We turn now to the topic of Francis Bacon and the call for a new science. As I said at the end of the first lecture, Bacon is a good example of the change occurring in higher education. He enters Trinity College, Cambridge University at the age of 13, brimming with worldly ambitions and concerns, destined for a high political career. He will, in fact, rise to the position of Lord Chancellor in England, from which he will fall on a charge of bribery. On the other hand, all Lord Chancellors in Britain in the 16th century and 17th century were guilty of bribery. But encountering, despite these worldly ambitions, the traditional Aristotelian education that dominates the curriculum at Cambridge. I had hinted at the official status. Let me read you, in fact, from the charter of Trinity College that was given to all incoming undergraduates. Quote, all students and undergraduates, my students hate that distinction, all students and undergraduates should lay aside their various authors and only follow Aristotle and those that defend him. So there in Protestant England, the same dominance of Aristotelian scholasticism. The charter forbade, quote, all sterile and inane questions disagreeing from the ancient and true philosophy. One of Bacon's biographers, his dear friend Rowley, wrote that it was at Cambridge that Bacon, quote, first fell into the dislike of the philosophy of Aristotle, being a philosophy only strong for disputations and contentions, but barren of the production of works for the benefit of mankind, end quote. And in that observation by Bacon's friend, indeed, is the heart and soul of Bacon's assault upon the traditional philosophy. In several works written between 1602 and 1608, Francis Bacon began his momentous assault upon the traditional philosophies. He condemned the European philosophical tradition entirely on several grounds. It had mixed religion and natural philosophy, he wrote, to the confusion of both. It had failed to understand the difference between a pious question asked from the perspective of the knowledge of faith and a question about the natural order that must be answered by the patient acquisition of natural knowledge. It had confused our faith and our natural philosophy. Secondly, it had substituted a concern for words in the place of a concern for things. This is one of the most obsessive and deep themes in all of Francis Bacon's life's work and its appeal. The argument that somehow the Western mind had become attached to words, to language, to the arguments of philosophy, rather than to the things of the created world by which it found itself surrounded. Instead of learning from patient, humble observation of God's actual creation, European thinkers in Bacon's early criticisms were portrayed as having devoted themselves to verbal, to rhetorical skills, designed only to win personal fame as a disputant, to shine at the university, to gain prizes and admiration, but all from the manipulation of words and never from some linkage of the human mind to the things of the world itself. At most, for Bacon, looking at that part of the disputation that had to do with experience, the European philosophers had masqueraded a few perfectly commonplace observations, mostly untested, as if they were the fruits of genuine, patient inquiry into the world. And where we needed desperately a knowledge of nature that could alter the human condition for our betterment by understanding and interacting more favorably with the things of the world, we had from our most educated students only sophistry and debating techniques. In a metaphor among many, for Bacon loves metaphors, in a metaphor crucial to his thought, Bacon called for a divorce of theology and natural philosophy, and a new marriage in natural philosophy of the human mind, quote, with things themselves in a chaste, holy, and legal wedlock, end quote. Instead of the unholy alliance of minds and words, human creations, we needed a marriage of minds and the actual things of God's creation, and that marriage should be, we'll explore the metaphor, chaste, holy, and legal. By chaste, Bacon means without ornamentation, simple, without flights of fancy. Chaste not only did not mean barren for Bacon, but a chaste marriage, without flights of fancy, without ornamentation, without self-indulgence, would be the only kind of marriage of mind and things from which there might issue offspring worthy of European philosophy, a knowledge of God's actual created world. That marriage had to be holy, by which Bacon meant two things. One, that it must be undertaken with Christian humility and reverence. For Bacon, what is involved in the Aristotelian scholastic system is, in one very real religious sense, a blasphemy, something unholy. It is the imposition upon God of a human scheme for what the world somehow had to be. It is taking the fanciful product of a human mind and imposing that upon God's work. A proper Christian, humble philosophy, in Bacon's view, would assume that we begin not knowing, that we begin in ignorance, and that we must patiently and without arrogance learn from study of the creation what God actually has wrought in the creation, and not impose our philosophical schemes upon it. A second meaning of holy, and it's very critical for understanding Bacon's appeal in Protestant England in the 17th century. And among other things, his appeal often in Calvinist and Puritan circles as well, is that philosophy must be holy in the sense of producing charitable work, motivated by Christian knowledge, by Christian charity. A knowledge that can be used to alleviate human misery, to increase human well-being, to reduce the suffering of one's neighbors, to enhance the quality of the lived life of one's fellow creatures. The Aristotelian scholastic system, from Bacon's perspective, only won glory for its verbal practitioners, and nothing followed from it that reduced human suffering, that increased the ease, the well-being of the human condition. Proper knowledge, then, must be wholly in the sense of humble, not imposing a system upon the creation, but learning from study of the creation what God actually has done, and motivated by charity, giving us a kind of knowledge that we may use to reduce human suffering, to enhance human well-being, and it must be legal, by which Bacon meant according to rules and proper method. Philosophy, he believed, had been governed by human self-indulgence. We believed those things that we wanted to believe. We believed those things that our genius could assemble into some intricate, harmonious system so that we could admire our own handiwork. The antidote to that was a proper method for the acquisition of knowledge. Absent that, for Bacon, we were lost. He compared method to a path. He said there are runners who are very fast, but if you put them on the wrong path, their speed only takes them further away from where they want to be more quickly. You can take someone who is slow. If you put that person on the proper path, that person will arrive at the desired place. Method served the function of that path. Put genius in possession of a wrong method for learning of the world, and genius will fly ever more quickly to error and fancy. What the species needed was a method so that it could link its minds to the things of the world, humbly and productive of works, to reduce human suffering and to enhance human well-being. For Bacon, European thought had become enslaved to the systems of 5 or 6 Greeks who had locked themselves away in scholars' cells and earned fame by devising pompous systems of all-inclusive knowledge of the world. These systems of thought had no place, he believed, in Christianity. They were devoid of the fruits of charity. They had infected Europe's relationship to nature and had cast the shadows of empty theories and systems between humankind and the natural objects with which we lived. But having made this criticism, Bacon found himself facing an awesome challenge. How does one convince thinkers to abandon a system of philosophy and accept a new method of philosophy when their very criteria for accepting or rejecting systems of philosophy, their very standards by which to judge methods, are based upon the very philosophy you would have them reject, the very system of thought in which they all had been raised? Aristotelian method and substance was taught in a work that all students pass through in the course of their education, the Organon, and Bacon audaciously wrote a new organon, a new instrument of knowledge, and he addressed the problem he faced head-on and dramatically. Quote, "I cannot be called upon to abide by the sentence of a tribunal which is itself on trial." End quote. He would not seek to convince anyone within Aristotelian ways of reasoning to reject anything philosophical. for it was precisely the Aristotelian enterprise that he was challenging. My disagreement, he wrote, quote, is upon first principles and very notions, and even upon forms of demonstration, end quote. Facing such an extraordinary challenge, Bacon appealed not to philosophy itself, but to the human consequences of thinking differently. Bacon essentially sought that his readers should agree with him on one proposition about being human and one proposition about being Christian. Concerning our being human, that we should put philosophy in the service of the human desire to be less helpless, less passive in the face of nature. The end of knowledge, the goal of knowledge that Bacon proposed, was the expansion of human empire over the phenomena on which our suffering or our well-being depended. If that were the goal of human knowledge, to be less helpless, to be less passive, to be able to alter our fate in terms of suffering or well-being, if you granted him that, Bacon then argued, he could show you that new kinds of knowledge and new methods of knowledge must be sought to achieve that goal. Secondly, Bacon appeals to a Christian ethic, that human knowledge must be in the service of charity. That as Christians, we are, he addresses his 17th century audience, enjoined above all in our relationships with other human beings to be governed by charity. We shall know things, Bacon writes, by their fruits, and the fruits of knowledge must be charity, service and ministering to one's fellow creatures. As Bacon put it, quote, there is no sign more certain and more noble than that from fruits. In religion, we are warned that faith must be shown by works. It is altogether right to apply the same test to philosophy. If it be barren, let it be set at naught. End quote. If it be barren, let it be set at naught, zero, a wholly new beginning, an absolute break with the past of European knowledge. That phrase philosophy needs some clarification here. Philosophy is all human knowledge for the medieval and 17th century mind that is independent of theology. That is why people receive doctorates in philosophy, even if they study literature or the biological sciences. We've inherited that, the title doctor, and Latin diplomas from the medieval and 17th century university. Philosophy is all human knowledge, other than that which stems from theology. So think then upon the drama of what Bacon is writing in the early 17th century. If it be barren, let it be set at naught. Let all prior claims of human knowledge, all prior claims of method, all human learning be set to zero. Let us break absolutely with authority, and let us have a new beginning to the human attempt to know and to understand the things of nature. From this point on, Bacon set for himself a monumental task, which he could never complete, that he termed the Great Instauration, that is to say, the great new beginning. In his original design, it was to talk about how learning could be advanced, what the method of learning should be, and by application of that method, what we actually did and did not know, and how we might proceed to know more. He did finish its most essential part, the new Organon, the new method for acquiring useful knowledge. There are 4 great themes to Bacon's work. First, the argument that knowledge is human power, that knowledge is power, that knowledge of plants is not to contemplate them in light of their forms, their perfections, their relationship to things divine, but to know things about plants that allow us to be spared the starvation of failed harvests, that allow us to predict the circumstances of enhanced plant growth. Knowledge of rivers is not contemplative appreciation of the scholastic system of perfections and purposes, but understanding of rivers that allows one to harness their energies, to utilize their forces, to predict their behaviors, to avoid floods and ravages. When you know something, you don't just have a contemplative appreciation in Bacon's system of knowledge. When you know something, you are capable of altering your interrelationship with the thing known. You have increased your power over the human interaction with the objects of your knowledge. Familiar with worldly, commercial, political England, Bacon is enormously impressed by just how much has been accomplished outside of the universities, away from the learned, on the basis of unmethodical, unsystematic, haphazard observation. What sailors have come to know about the seas, about navigation. What merchants have come to know about weights and measures. What one has come to know about mining and testing, assaying the purity of currency. What one has come to know about artillery and the means of warfare. For Bacon, all of these conquests of knowledge have occurred apart from the world of the most learned, with no method, haphazardly, randomly, by trial and error, hit or miss. Imagine, Bacon appeals to his audience, if we sought that kind of knowledge actually knowing what we were doing, systematically, on the basis of a sound method. Though the philosophers have failed to pay attention to it, we've accomplished so much by chance in those areas where people understand that knowledge must be power. The invitation is, how might human beings alter the very relationship of our species to nature if the learned ever got serious about studying the human world. Now, often Bacon's model of knowledge is power is cited as if it were a glorification of human empire for the sake of human empire over nature. Two cautions must always be added to our understanding of Bacon here. One, his insistence that the model be charity, never private gain, never private aggrandizement. And two, that power over nature only comes from being humble in the face of nature. In Bacon's celebrated aphorism, quote, nature can only be commanded by being obeyed, end quote. If we impose our scheme on nature, we're helpless in its presence. But if we learn from nature what nature is, if we obey nature in the formulation of our knowledge, then we are in a position to increase human empire. The second great theme to Bacon's work is the separation of natural philosophy, what we would now call science, from theology. The mixture for Bacon, and it is a theme we shall hear much of in the course of the 17th century, of natural philosophy and Christian theology has nothing to do with the things of faith. Scripture did not enjoin upon us a set of favored philosophers. Strictures is the proper intellectual methods. Canonical authors on the subject of astronomy or navigation or natural history. We must, Bacon wrote, give to faith those things that are faiths. But then faith must give to natural reason those things that are the province of natural reason. It is not the business of a student of the natural order to tell people how to go to heaven, what virtue is, what charity is. But it is not the province of a theologian to tell us how plants grow, how rivers behave, how nature is organized as a natural system. The third great theme of Bacon's system is the method of induction. In logic, we distinguish between two categorically distinct uses of human reason. One, when we know a general principle to be true, as in geometry, the deduction, the drawing out from it of what follows. Given our knowledge of straight lines, we may deduce that parallel lines never intersect. The other method in the use of logic is induction, in which we move from particular things known to general principles that are true about those particulars. This is, for Bacon, the only method appropriate to the acquisition of new and useful knowledge. In theology, in the law, deduction indeed should be the method. But if we are to learn from nature, we must do that inductively. We must experience the particulars of nature, induce from our knowledge of the particulars generalizations that are true about those particular things. And then we must test them, for the test must always be in nature. If I am correct that this is generally true about all of these particulars, then the following should happen in the following set of circumstances. So there is the heart and soul of Bacon's method. We observe nature, its particulars, the actual behavior of things. We induce from knowledge of those particulars generalizations. We test them in experiments designed to see if we have understood the behavior of things. When we have sets of generalizations, we then seek to make generalizations about our generalizations to induce yet more general knowledge. So we know certain things about apple trees, about cherry trees, about peach trees, and then we seek to know what we know about trees, and combining that with other sets of generalizations, what we know about agriculture, botany, plant growth. This is the method of induction, and at each step, we are to let nature command us. And the way to do that is by devising the experiment that would show if I am correct, certain things must follow, and to test if they follow. We see here a very dramatic assault upon authority. We shall assume nothing. We shall not draw our knowledge from texts, from prior authors. We shall draw our knowledge from observation, induction, and experiment upon nature. And we see here a very dramatic assault upon the authority of the syllogism. For the value of the syllogism is only as high as the certainty of its premises. If A is true, if B is true, then C follows. But exactly what we don't know is A true? Exactly what we don't know is B true? The syllogism makes us logically consistent, but it makes us logically consistent in our ignorance or in our error. And knowledge must proceed inductively from the study of nature. Finally, the fourth major theme of Bacon's system is that science, natural philosophy, must be a dynamic, cooperative, and cumulative enterprise. One mind will not master the creation. The natural order is not something that genius contemplates and solves all areas of. There will be no new Aristotle who understands it all. It is so very difficult to know, to eke out our knowledge, to scratch for real generalizations about the natural order, and we begin in such abysmal ignorance because of our having been enslaved to philosophical systems. We begin in such abysmal ignorance of the world we're in and what's in it and how things work and how things proceed, that we must always proceed dynamically, open to change, always revising, always testing, always letting new knowledge modify what we thought we knew. We must proceed cooperatively with different researchers working in a great variety of fields of inquiry. And we must be cumulative in our knowledge, always moving to higher and higher orders of generalization. Now, this notion of a cumulative science is a very dramatic intellectual and moral break in the way a society can see itself. So think of the model of Aristotelian scholasticism. There were the great authorities. There were the Greeks. There was Aristotle. We are pygmies on the shoulders of giants, seeing only because they saw, producing nothing greater than they, looking back to a golden age of knowledge. There was this one explosion that was Greece and Rome. It preceded Christianity. Then came Christian theology, the synthesis of the two, and we have what we need, and we look back to the ages of genius. Bacon's model reverses that entire structure, and one can think of progress. The future will always know more than the past. We may always advance. We may always proceed. To do this, however, we had to overcome all of the weaknesses of the human mind, for it was not accidental that we were so bogged down in error. Bacon offered a metaphor of three kinds of mind. There was the ant that just piled up data, just made piles of things, and saw nothing in it. There was the spider, who wove an exquisite and complex web, but of the stuff of its own being. The ants were just the collectors of fact who had made no contribution to real knowledge. The spiders were the Greek philosophers, the Aristotelian scholastics, who spun out these intricate systems that had no relationship to reality, was just of their own imagination. Rather, he said, the natural philosopher must become like the honeybee, who takes from the things of nature, mixes it with the stuff of his own being, inductive method, reason, experiment, and produces something sweet and useful to human life. But why so many spiders? Why so many philosophers with these whole systems? Because, Bacon wrote, we worshipped false idols in the world of knowledge. First, there were what he called the idols of the tribe, all of the things inherent in human nature that led us into error. We flew to order. We tried to see order where none existed. We were impatient. As a species, we wanted to know everything at once and make sense of it. We were not systematic. We were affected by sudden experience. One violent thunderstorm taught one more than 1,000 days of patient observation of nature because it made a deeper impression. Our senses were deceptive and prone to error, which is why we needed experiment. We were affected by emotion and what we wanted to believe. There were idols of the cave, he wrote. Idols of the individual man. Our own peculiar, particular biases and predispositions arising from differences of physiology, psychology, educational experience, hence the need for collective effort. There were idols of the marketplace, the stuff in which we engaged in the exchange, the currency of philosophy, words. Words distorted and misled us again and again. We had allowed our philosophies to develop around ambiguous, equivocal words. The same word could mean 15 different things. We had ambiguous abstractions that preceded and controlled our observations and our pursuit of knowledge. Instead, he urged, words should arise to be applied to rigorous, methodical observation, and the sciences, a word should have a fixed meaning. Finally, there were what he called idols of the theater, our received philosophical tradition and heritage, above all Aristotle, for whom he reserved his most intense invective, but above all, the whole notion of authority. We should not be impressed that anything has stood the test of time, Bacon wrote. If you think of things on a river, what is profound sinks and disappears. He did have a way with metaphors. What was light and insignificant was carried along. the rivers and oceans of time. We should not be impressed by what had reached us. Rather, Bacon offered a new vision to the learned world, that the proper use of the human mind could produce a new relationship between humankind and nature, in which mankind actively could seek for its betterment. He wrote a utopian work, The New Atlantis, in which human beings govern their relationship to nature and to society on behalf of their real interests. And the instrument was knowledge. Knowledge neither speculative nor magical, but knowledge methodically drawn by patient observation and experiment, producing verifiable and serviceable truths about the behavior of the things of this world. At the center of the New Atlantis stood the House of Solomon, where the natural philosophers dwelled and devoted themselves to the good of the human community. And over its door was written its goal, quote, "The end of our foundation is the knowledge of causes and the secret motions of things, and the enlarging of the bounds of human empire to the effecting of all things possible." To the extent that Europeans of the 17th century, for whatever reasons, were prepared to believe that progress was possible, that one could alter the human relationship to nature and to the world, be a species less fatalistic and more master of our misery or well-being, to that extent were they prepared to accept the invitation of Francis Bacon. And as the century progressed, it was a vision that would gain with increasing frequency disciples. Thank you very much.